Welcome back for round 5 of the Maritime Open. This is the first round of the last day of the tournament, and I've been feeling quite good about my performance in this tournament. In the first 4 rounds, I have 3.5 points, and I'm expecting to face pretty stiff competition today. So I had the black pieces for this game, and here we go. So white played e4, and I played the Caro-Kann opening. And then white goes into kind of a main line. I captured this pawn. They captured back with the knight. And then after knight f6, they moved the knight to g3. I've actually played against this line once before in a tournament, and I didn't really do a lot of prep against it actually. But in that game, I'll link the video to it here in the description. In that game, I managed eventually to get an e5 push, capture on d4, and then cause white to have an isolated queen's pawn. And I did it in such a way that I could blockade that pawn with a knight. And so although I wasn't really prepared per se, like I didn't have like a lot of lines prepared, I thought maybe a similar idea could work. So, and I forgot to mention as well, you can see that my opponent is a bit higher rated than me, so I'm expecting this to be kind of a tough game. We'll see how it proceeds. So I was thinking about doing this e5 push eventually. So I decided to push g6 to develop the bishop out this way, so I don't have to commit anything with this pawn yet. After knight f3, I brought the bishop out to g4, bishop e2, bishop g7, c3, castles, castles. So far, it's all looking pretty standard. Things are looking pretty good. It looks like I should be able to make this e5 push work eventually. So I develop out my knight, also covering that e5 square. And then seeing what I'm up to, my opponent put the rook on the e file just to kind of preemptively try to cover this square as well. I decided it's pretty simple for me just to do the same, so I can also sort of fight for control of this file. Queen c2, and now I decided to go for it. I decided, all right, I'm going to trade off this bishop and push e5 because I think now is the moment. I was considering putting the queen on c7 here before pushing because it would just add another more control of this square, but I decided that I didn't need to at this point. I actually end up putting the queen there a little bit later, but so I snapped off the knight and pushed e5. Now, another option, I was analyzing this with a friend later, and another option here actually would have been to push c5 instead, so kind of attack on the flank rather than attacking in the middle. And it's an interesting idea after takes. Now in this position, we have a bit of an imbalance. So it's a 3-on-2 on the queen side and a 4 on 3 on the king side, which is interesting. I have a central pawn and white does not. So having a pawn in the center means that the center isn't quite as open, and so it might mean that the bishop pair is not as strong as in positions where all of the central pawns are gone. So that might favor black a little bit. However, a queenside majority could also be very strong in an endgame. So if you imagine that all of the other pieces are off the board and the kings are over here on the king side, then a 3-on-2 with these pawns could actually be really strong for white because the king may take a while to get over and defend. So that's an interesting idea, and it's one that I don't think about maybe as much as I should, kind of doing an attack on the flank instead of in the center. So I went ahead with e5. I should mention here too, another option, so c5 was an option here. Another option would have been to push e6 instead. So I kind of had in my head that I wanted to do this e5 push, but e6 has some benefits as well. Since I don't have a light squared bishop anymore, I can put a bunch of pawns on light squares. And then maybe I can still put a knight on this square, which is kind of nice, although it can be kicked pretty quickly at this point, so I'm not sure if it's nice right away, but eventually that square could be nice for a knight. And so e6 feels a little bit slow and maybe passive, but it is also an option here. The engine does like e5, so I'm not 100% sure that it sort of worked out in the end, as we'll see, but it is the top engine move. And then instead of capturing right away, white brought out the bishop to e3. And so I didn't want to capture right here because I didn't want this bishop to end up on this diagonal and potentially able to trade off for my dark squared bishop, because I feel like this dark squared bishop in a fianchettoed setup usually is a very important defender for the king. So instead, I finally moved my queen here. And now the idea is, if I capture and the bishop goes here, I can always push c5 to kick the bishop off of that diagonal. So rook ad1, and now I went ahead and captured. And so as I mentioned, if this happens, I'm just going to push c5. But instead, white captured with the c pawn, which kind of seems like what I was going for all along, right? I wanted to get this isolated queen's pawn position against white, and now my knight can pretty quickly sort of zigzag around and jump onto the d5 square. I don't want to put this knight on the d5 square yet because it's being covered by the bishop. I figure if I can get this knight there, then, you know, if the bishop takes, I can replace it with another knight. But I missed something in this position, missed something quite important. And I'm not going to say it costed me the game because it didn't lose the game on the spot, but it kind of messed with my head, as we're going to see. At this point, once this happened, I actually played this knight b6 move quite quickly because I felt like it was the right move. I felt like I'd been planning for it all along. I'm going to put this knight right here. At this point, I remember I made the move, and then I got up and left the playing hall to go to the washroom. And I was very surprised when I got back that my opponent had just pushed d5 anyway. And I was like, wait, what? Like they can't push d5. I'm covering it with two knights and a pawn, and so I should just be able to take that pawn. But I can't. And you may have seen it already. I didn't see it until I came back and they had pushed that pawn. So if I capture here, the problem is this pawn is now pinned to my queen, and my queen is undefended. So if this pawn ever captures on d5, then I lose my queen. So the line might look something like this. If bishop takes, knight takes, rook takes, now I'm down a piece for a pawn, and I can't capture with this pawn. And so that was disappointing. That was very disappointing. But I realized, you know, it's not the end of the world. I decided to move my a rook over to c8, and now I'm sort of re-threatening capturing here. Both my opponent and I sort of were calculating what happens if this pawn is pushed right here. And I think for both of us, it was a little bit unclear whether that was going to work. So he just captured, I recaptured with this pawn, and this was the position. Now, this isn't the end of the world, but I think it kind of messed with my mindset a bit here, because I feel like at this point, my pawn structure is damaged. My whole idea of trying to get this isolated queen's pawn that I can blockade with something like a knight, that's all out the window now. Like, my plan is completely gone. And I think, like, these sorts of positions where I'm not very solid, these sorts of positions where I have some weaknesses that I need to deal with, sometimes are really hard for me to handle, I think. And I think it's because, like, I'm not sure. Like, I think my mindset just kind of goes to a place where I feel like I'm losing, and I'm not losing. Like, this is perfectly fine. You know, material is equal. Probably white is a bit better. Like, it's plus 0.6 according to the engine here. So white definitely has an edge, but black is not losing by any means. But yeah, I needed to kind of get my psychology in check here, and make sure that I'm still playing the right moves and finding the right defensive resources where I can. Anyway, in this position, white played bishop c5, which I was a little bit confused about. I wasn't quite sure why they would bring the bishop there, but after knight d7, I just kind of wanted to get this knight more centralized, maybe going to e5 eventually, because I felt like the knight was a little misplaced over on this side of the board. White went back to a3 with the bishop, and this is just kind of a nice diagonal for the bishop to be holding on to. Like, one could argue that it's not really active on a3, but it's certainly controlling a lot of squares on the on black's side of the board. So it's not a bad square. I put my knight on e5, and then after bishop e2, I put my other knight on d5. And now I was actually starting to feel pretty good. What does the engine say here? It still says that white has an edge. It's plus 0.4, but black does have some pretty good activity. I think the problem is I started to get some activity, and then I started looking for tactics. So I felt like the way to come out of this game and to fix the error that I had made was to find some sort of killer tactical shot that was gonna like open up the king side or win material or do something. And so I was doing all kinds of evaluation of like sacking the knight there or bringing this knight around and looking to do something with it. And I kind of got a bit of tunnel vision. For some reason, I felt like that was the only solution. I had to have some kind of nasty tactic against the king, rather than just kind of playing calmly and defending really well, which probably would have been the right the right strategy, but at least the right mindset to be in, rather than kind of trying to play for some sort of trick. That might work in Blitz and Bullet, but in these slower tournament games, probably that wasn't going to work, finding some tactical shot. But anyway, white played here, probably just adding another defender to this square so that I don't have it for my knight. And then I played queen a5, which the engine doesn't really love this move, but I kind of liked how, well, again, I'm sort of looking for tactics, and it did kind of cause problems against this rook in some lines, and it made things kind of complicated. Also, this pawn cannot push now because the bishop would hang, which is just also an interesting thing. So again, I'm looking for tactics, trying to do something against the king, and now white plays knight e4, which this actually kind of freaked me out. I wasn't expecting this move, and I hadn't seen that this square was quite weak. And of course, this square would be a fork on my rooks. And further, the bishop is covering the square as well. So once the knight goes there, it's going to be really hard to kick the knight and send it anywhere else. I don't have a pawn that can kick it. Maybe I can do something with my bishop on f8, perhaps. I'm not sure. But not right away, because once it goes there, like I need to do something now to deal with the fact that my rooks are potentially in trouble. And so I played rook c d8, which is probably one of the worst moves that I could have played in this position. And I think the reason that I played I think I just didn't think it through really closely, because again, I think I had this sort of tunnel vision, looking to get that knight there, or maybe put this knight here attacking this bishop, and then maybe sack it here so that after takes I can put that knight there and get a fork on that rook. Like, I was just looking at everything kind of in that corner of the board, and I just wanted to do something quick, like, okay, if the knight comes here, then I'll just throw this rook up onto this square or something like that. But that doesn't work, because if the knight comes in here, then because I've put this rook over here, now if I do something like rook up here, then there's actually another fork, which I've opened up because of where I put this rook. And so if instead I put the rook here, for example, to cover this square, well, now there is this move, which is a double attack on the queen and on this rook, because there's this discovered attack. And so this rook move was not the right way to go. Probably better would have been to move this rook over. And now if the knight comes in, then I can just move this rook over to b8 and add some pressure down this file. There isn't a fork here anymore, and things would be much better for me. This maybe also works. I think this is also perfectly fine. Anyway, so I played this wrong, but for some reason, my opponent didn't bring the knight in here. They pushed the bishop back onto there instead. And so there still aren't really any tactics here, although with the bishop moving back, I'm seriously looking at a tactic where I put the knight on f3, and then after that capture... That's right, yeah. I wanted to get rid of this knight so that after this capture, I could actually potentially win this rook here. So that's kind of something that I'm looking at. And again, kind of getting tunnel vision, trying to make this tactic work. So I pushed f5, and the idea was, let's get that knight out of there so I can make this tactic work. However, this opens up this light squared diagonal against my king, and white still has a light squared bishop, which could very easily get onto that diagonal, and that would put a lot of pressure against my king quite quickly. So white moved the knight to d2, and I was calculating that if they move here, then there might be some crazy crazy tactics where I finally do this knight move, I take this rook, and then basically I was miscalculating that if they try for this fork, now my rook is going to be able to take here, and then I'll win 2 rooks for the queen, and then I'll eventually win this bishop as well. Of course, that doesn't work because this knight is still here. So my calculation was not particularly good. Interestingly, this tactic would have worked a little bit later in the game, and even though I was trying to find it here, I totally missed it later on when it was actually going to work. So, but instead of playing knight here, they put the knight up on d2, and I played knight f4. So again, looking for tactics, gonna sack a knight in order to win that rook, or something along those lines. Of course, that also doesn't quite work yet because of this. Yeah, I think it does, because if takes, check, takes, now I can win that rook there, or something. Except that knight also defends it. So I'm not even sure it works in this position. But this is what I was doing, was still, like, I was bringing that up to still kind of try desperately to find some kind of tactic. The engine likes actually several moves here, but even just like moving the king off of this weak diagonal would have been a perfectly fine move here, because there are a lot of lines as well where this bishop comes out or the queen comes down, and of course after this knight has moved, and delivers a check if that knight isn't there as well. So getting the king kind of preventatively off of g8 would have been good here as well. But I played knight f4. And then my opponent played knight c4. And again, this is a move that I wasn't really expecting, because they are hitting the queen, potentially hitting that knight. But if I capture and they capture, then there's a check. And I think maybe in this position I had seen this possibility, but I just thought, okay, I can just trade off and then continue with my plans, right? Except I didn't see until after they made the move that this was actually going to be a check. And so I feel like I might have been getting into a little bit of time trouble here too. I don't remember being like really low on the clock, but I was down relative to my opponent. So I thought for a while, and then I figured, all right, let's just snap off the knight and figure it out. And according to the engine, I think that was basically the game-losing move. Like here, it's still kind of drawish, and then after I capture here, you can see the eval goes way down for black. It's plus 4.9 in this position. And so this is the one place, now that this file is opened up, the queen is still here. This is the one place where this tactic actually works and maintains equality. And of course I missed it, because after takes, and I take here, now, in a beautiful turn of events, if white tries to take this rook, the queen is actually protecting it. And if white takes my queen, then I capture here, and this bishop is also going to fall. And so I have 2 rooks for the queen, basically, and also these pawns that I can potentially target. Now my king is fairly open, but once this bishop falls, then their king is also in trouble, and this knight is here taking some squares. And technically, I think this is 0.0. Yeah, this is a drawn position if played correctly, of course. But despite having looked for that tactic all game, in the one place where it was actually possible, I missed it because I got distracted by the fact that now my queen is under attack. I was surprised by this move. I hadn't seen it for some reason. And so I snapped off the knight. They captured with a check. And then the rest of it is just kind of me trying to defend, but there is not much hope. So I blocked with the knight. They traded rooks and picked up this pawn. So now I'm actually a pawn down. I bring my knight back to defend. They attack it. And I bring the queen over, just trying to like cluster here and really defend everything. going after this pawn, and then I figured, okay, maybe I have some counterplay against this pawn right here. Really, I would like to put my queen either there or there in order to defend this pawn and hit this one. But of course, these squares are covered nicely by white. So after this move, I did kind of a desperado thing, trying against this pawn, trying to win that pawn, not really realizing that after the queen takes here, this pawn is actually covered by the queen. And so that was, yet another oversight on my part. But really, like, the game is over at this point anyway. I tried one last little trick, trying to get something happening here. But then finally, white exploits this diagonal, pushes my king into the corner, and then this is checkmate. And actually here, like, I saw that I could move the king here, rook could take, and then I thought I could move my king somewhere and maybe, hold on to things. But of course, this is just checkmate. And it's funny because my opponent made this move, and then I sat there kind of looking and looking and looking, and then I looked up and said, that's checkmate, isn't it? Because it took me a while to figure out that it was checkmate, because I think at this point, my brain was just, I don't know where it was. It was not in the right mindset for playing this game correctly. So it was an interesting one. It was my first loss of the tournament, actually, which I'm pretty proud of being able to go this far. This was round 5. Getting all the way to round 5 without actually losing a game. So I think it was maybe about time. So a few key moments, missing the pinned pawn on move 15. Let me just find this move. Yeah. In this move 15, is that right? Yes. In this position, like, again, this was not losing the game, but it's where I kind of lost the mindset or the psychological game after realizing that, like, I felt like I was in such a good position once I could blockade that pawn, and then realizing that didn't work because of this pawn pin that I had missed kind of got me in that losing mindset, unfortunately. And then, as I said, like, being a bit overly focused on trying to get some kind of cheap shot, some kind of tactic against the king, rather than, like, really trying to find the correct defensive resources, was definitely something. Like on move 22 here, yeah, like not correctly evaluating what happens when this knight goes here, and realizing that this move is no good because it opens up this potential fork as well. Again, just like really in this mindset of trying to find tactics rather than finding the right defense. And then, of course, like, missing the one place where the tactic actually worked, because I was just kind of, I don't know, feeling desperate at that point after the knight moved over here and was attacking my queen. I just, I felt like I needed to snap it off and do something. I just was not thinking accurately in that position. So yeah, very interesting game. Definitely interesting that I felt like my psychology and mindset really played a big role in this game. And it's something that I need to work on, especially when I'm in these positions where I feel like I have some weaknesses. And I think those sorts of positions are one of my weaknesses, like trying to figure out how to defend against these things. I had a game in a previous tournament which was like this as well. I went down a pawn, I had some pawns that were split up, and I just didn't quite know how to defend properly and didn't know how to move forward. So, but in any case, this was round 5. And I still have 3.5 points with 1 game to go, the evening after this game is done. And so we'll see how that goes. Even at this point, I'm quite proud of how I performed in this tournament. I'm hoping for at least a draw in the last round, but we'll see. I was always expecting to kind of face some stiff competition on this last day because of how well I had done up to there. So this was a loss, but still feeling pretty good and ready for the last round. So that video will be coming soon, and I'll see you then.